Residents in the bayside suburbs of Seaford and Frankston are living in terror following the second stabbing murder in recent weeks.
My husband won't let me out after dark unless I've got one of the dogs with me.
The body of Deborah Fream was found beside a dirt road in farmland at Carrum Downs.
Police are also appealing to anyone who may have information about...
I go to the nightclubs and that, and there aren't that many single girls going there now, because it's too dangerous for them to be out at night time.
If there is a serial killer at work here, it's places like this where he stalks his prey.
Your friend's up the road, but you're too scared to go and see them.
Can you tell me why you attacked her on that night?
Just wanted to kill.
In 1993, the bayside suburb of Frankston, Victoria was terrorised by Paul Charles Denyer. After the horrific crimes he committed, he was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. He will be eligible for parole in several months' time. For a 7-week period in mid-1993, the residents of the Melbourne suburb Frankston lived in fear as a number of women who lived in the area were abducted and attacked in a series of vicious crimes. Throughout the early 80s and leading into the early 90s, a number of murders and disappearances had the citizens of Frankston and the surrounding areas fearful that a serial killer was on the loose. Welcome back to the final episode in our Frankston series here on Shadow Matter, where we delve into the crimes that plagued the suburb and its citizens during the 80s and 90s. If you haven't seen the other videos, a playlist will be linked in the description below. Before we get into our subject today, I would like to put forward a few disclaimers. For a brief period of time, recently, Paul Denyer identified as a trans woman and temporarily changed his name to Paula. However, in 2022, has now since reverted to calling himself Paul. So for the purposes of this video, I will be referring to Denyer as Paul and not Paula. But we will have more on that later. I do not intend any disrespect towards any of the victims mentioned or their families. This video is intended to highlight the upcoming parole of Paul Denyer and to remind the people of how much pain and torment he has caused. On that note, there is a petition against his parole, and if you would like to sign that petition, I will have it linked in the description of this video. Furthermore, it is not my intention to demonize the area of Frankston in any way. I merely find these cases intriguing, as they all happened within a relatively short period of time.
Bro, this ain't glorious. It's Frankston.
Frankston has held a bit of a mixed reputation over the years, as already discussed in previous episodes. But the one thing that seems to hurt this suburb's reputation more than anything else is its history of horrific crimes. Beginning with the Frankston Tynong North serial killings in the early 80s, and again in the early 90s after the disappearance of Sarah MacDiarmid and the unsolved murder of Michele Brown. And then came the Frankston serial killings. During a 7-week period beginning in June of 1993 and ending in July, 3 young women lost their lives at the hand of a sadistic killer. Elizabeth Stevens, 18, Deborah Fream, 22, and Natalie Russell, 17. The period of time between these crimes did not immediately put the citizens of Frankston into a state of panic. In fact, it wasn't until after Paul Denyer's second victim, Deborah Fream, that the police and civilians began to fear for the worst. Everybody seemed on edge. Could there possibly be a serial killer stalking the streets of Frankston? Now for context, I'm going to be asking my wife, who lived and worked in the Frankston and Mornington Peninsula area during this time, what exactly it was like.
Were you familiar with the area of Frankston?
Very familiar. We not only used to go out there, but it was the closest city or town, big town, to our little, where we lived.
During the Frankston serial killings, like what age were you?
I was turning 18 that year, so prior to turning 18, 1992, we were going to an underage nightclub called Oxygen in Frankston. My friends and I used to catch the bus from our town, which was about 30 minutes away, into Frankston. We'd go there and then we'd catch the train back, and our parents would pick us up at the local train station.
Do you remember what the overall feeling was like surrounding the Frankston serial killings?
I think the young, like us in as a younger generation, didn't really think that anything was going to happen to us. It was that whole teenage, we're invincible, nothing's ever going to happen. Parents, though, were very, very concerned about kids going out in Frankston, I remember my parents used to, if they were concerned, if we were going to be out past a certain time, they would actually come and pick us up. And some of our parents would take turns in doing those trips. So on a Saturday night at 3 a.m, one week would be my parents, the next week would be another friend's parents. Just because there was a lot of concern, we didn't know what was going on, how many people were going to end up being killed or anything like that.
Was there a heavy police presence during this time?
Not that I remember. I don't really remember seeing a lot of police around. The train station has always been notorious for a lot of drug users and the bad people, I suppose you'd say. And you'd always see a few police around there and a few police around the city, but I don't remember any massive police presence when I was going out around that time.
Were you or members of your family ever scared for your safety?
My parents were concerned, and that's why parents took turns. When me and my friends went out, parents would take turns in picking us up. We also stopped going out in Frankston and started going out more in Mornington or Hastings or Langwarrin or places like that. Even though Langwarrin was close to Frankston, it was further enough away, and we always had a designated driver, so we sort of stopped frequenting the Frankston clubs.
It was during the police investigations that police noted there may be a link to other crimes, most notably the disappearance of Sarah MacDiarmid, who was abducted from Gananook Station in Frankston in 1990. The police believed they might possibly be dealing with a serial killer. The media at the time shared this view and ran with that narrative.
The body of 25-year-old Michele Brown was found in March last year, and Sarah MacDiarmid was abducted from Gananook railway station in 1990. Her body was never found.
If there is a serial killer at work here, it's places like this where he stalks his prey. This area is full of young women and single mothers, people who used to feel safe here, but no longer.
The civilians were in fear for their loved ones. Parents set strict curfews for their daughters. Schools warned students not to walk alone. For those citizens of Frankston who were old enough to remember its past crimes, it felt like the suburb had been stuck in a recurring nightmare. In 1993, the residents of Frankston began to feel unsafe as rumours of women being stalked began to circulate amongst its population. There were a number of attacks and incidents attributed to the Frankston serial killings, but the first victim to lose their life was 18-year-old Elizabeth Stevens on the 11th of June, 1993. Elizabeth had moved to Melbourne from Tasmania earlier that same year for study and lived with her aunt and uncle in Langwarrin. On Friday, June 11th, Elizabeth made her intentions known that she was going to the library of the TAFE Institute in Frankston where she studied. She had got to the bus that day and would have got off the bus stop on Cranbourne Road, Frankston. Elizabeth told her aunt and uncle that they could expect her home around 8 p.m. When she didn't arrive home at 10 p.m, Elizabeth's uncle began searching for her in his car. The police were later notified at 1 a.m, but due to bad weather, which meant low visibility, nothing could be done. The next morning, a man found her partially hidden body in Lloyd Park Reserve, just a short distance from the bus stop on Cranbourne Road. Her body had been brutally butchered, and the killer carved a crisscross pattern into her chest. 4 weeks later, on the 8th of July, 41-year-old woman Rosa Toth was attacked at Seafood North Reserve at around 5:50 p.m. She had noticed a man loitering near the toilet block and was attacked shortly after. The man held a fake gun to her head, and Rosa pretended to submit. She broke free of her attacker and ran back to the road, where she stopped a passing car and asked for help. On that same night, 22-year-old Deborah Fream, who lived near Gananook Station, was abducted in her car at around 7 p.m. Deborah had recently given birth and left her 12-day-old baby at home in the care of a friend so that she could go to the shops to buy some milk. After an hour had passed and Deborah had not returned, the friend grew concerned and rang Deborah's boyfriend. The two searched for the young mother and notified the police. 4 days later, on the 12th of July, a farmer found Deborah's partially concealed body on Taylor's Road, Carrum Downs. The crime scene was very similar to that of Elizabeth Stevens. Deborah had been the victim of a frenzied knife attack. There was no doubt that this was the same attacker who killed Elizabeth Stevens. Almost 3 weeks later, the killer would strike again. On Friday the 30th of July, 17-year-old John Paul College student Natalie Russell finished school early and decided to walk home, taking a shortcut through a bike track on Sky Road, Frankston. This was around 2:30 p.m. At 8 p.m, Natalie's parents reported her missing to Frankston police. The report was treated as urgent. After speaking with the parents, police deduced that Natalie had taken the shortcut off Sky Road and quickly began searching the area. The search soon found Natalie's body in some scrub. She had been dragged through a hole cut in the wire fence and suffered a brutal knife attack. Forensics determined that Natalie had put up a huge fight, which may have angered her attacker and caused her death to be more violent than the previous victims.
The body of 17-year-old VCE student Natalie Russell was discovered at 11 o'clock last night, just over 2 hours after police launched an intensive search of the area when her family reported her missing. The killing follows the two earlier murders of Deborah Fream 3 weeks ago and Elizabeth Stevens on June the 12th. Detectives confirmed that she died from multiple stab wounds to the upper body. They are looking at the obvious similarities between the attacks.
Police initially became involved with the case of murders unknowingly, due to a break-in on a flat in February of 1993. I will touch upon this more later, but for a brief overview, there was a flat belonging to a young mother who was broken into and ransacked. The woman's cat was brutally disemboweled, and horrific threats were left at the scene, written using the cat's blood. The first incident to attract a large investigation was the murder of Elizabeth Stevens in June of that year. The day and night Elizabeth went missing, there had been a downpour of rain and stormy winds. When police were notified of Stevens' body, they set up a crime scene. Due to the weather conditions, not one single piece of foreign forensic evidence was found. Also due to poor visibility, police were unable to locate any witnesses to the crime. A post-mortem examination would reveal that Elizabeth was choked unconscious prior to being stabbed. The park where Elizabeth was found was only a short distance from her usual bus stop. The top half of her clothing was removed, but there was no evidence of sexual assault. The same non-result could be found with Deborah Fream's crime scene. However, when police located Deborah's grey Nissan Pulsar, a number of witnesses saw the car driving erratically and flashing its lights. Forensics found traces of Deborah's blood inside the car, and a dent in the front of the car that was not there before she went missing. It was a lucky break for police, for on the same night that Deborah Fream was abducted, another woman was attacked in the same area. Rosa Toth's attack, as mentioned before, she was the only eyewitness in regards to the serial killer. Police and investigators questioned her about her attacker's appearance. She described her attacker as between 18 to 20 years old, around 180 centimeters tall, or 5'10", a round face, blue eyes, and male. Investigators drew up a profile of the suspect. He was likely unemployed or working a menial job, likely to be a local resident, and was well familiar with the area. Aged between 18 to 24, average looking, and most likely lived alone. It wasn't until the attack of Natalie Russell that police finally had a breakthrough. At 2:30 p.m. on Friday the 30th of July, a courier was delivering post on her motorbike and noticed an old rusted yellow Toyota Corona parked on Sky Road, Frankston. As she drove along the road, she noticed a suspicious-looking man with a chubby face wearing a dark-coloured cap. The man slouched down in his seat, as if to avoid detection. The courier went into a nearby house to ask to use their phone. Given what was happening in the area, she felt it was best to report it to the police. When police arrived to inspect the car, they found the car empty, but noted down the registration and door-knocked on a few houses before they were called away for an armed robbery. Little did they know that Natalie Russell was being attacked down the bike track that led off Sky Road. The later forensic investigations of the walkway revealed 3 holes cut into the fence. These were used using the same tool. Foreign blood traces and skin and hair samples were found on Natalie. Police informed the investigation team of the witness account of the Toyota Corona. They then traced the registration and ownership back to one Paul Charles Denyer.
What is your age and date of birth?
I'm 21 years old. I was born on the 14th of April 1972.
Okay. Are you an Australian citizen?
Yeah. Grabbed her hair around the mouth, left hand, like this.
Yeah.
I dragged her through here. No, I've always wanted to kill.
Since when?
since I was about 14. I've been stalking women for a few years in Frankston. Just waiting for that opportunity.
Paul Charles Denyer was born on the 14th of April 1972 to British immigrant parents Anthony and Maureen Denyer in Campbelltown, New South Wales, near Sydney. He was the third of 6 children, 5 boys and 1 girl. The parents initially immigrated to Australia in 1965 and lived briefly in Adelaide before relocating to Victoria in 1981. None of the children approved of this move, but Paul seemed to be affected the most. Paul began to withdraw and found it hard to make friends. According to Denyer's mother, as an infant, he had rolled off a bench and hit his head whenever Paul did something out of the ordinary. They would jokingly blame this as a reason for his odd behaviour. This odd behaviour became more sinister by the age of 10, when Paul would regularly dissect his sister's teddy bear with a knife. One occasion saw him stab the family kitten and he hung it from a tree in the backyard. Paul Denyer grew into his teens as overweight and taller than the rest of his peers at school. His interest didn't lie in the usual realm of everyday children's. Instead, he opted to become fascinated by knives, clubs, and other weapons. His criminal convictions started in his early teens, when just before his 13th birthday, Paul was arrested for stealing a car, but was released with only a warning. 2 months later, he was charged with making a false report to the fire brigade. For reasons due to YouTube's policy, I'm unable to describe another of Denyer's offences, but for now, we'll just say at the age of 15, he was charged with assault. After finishing secondary school, Denyer began working at a supermarket, where he entered into a relationship with Sharon Johnson, who had also worked there. He was ultimately fired from this job when he allegedly knocked down a woman and a child with a convoy of trolleys. After this, interestingly, Paul Denyer applied to join the Victorian Police, but was rejected due to being unfit. Denyer's last place of employment was a marine workshop where he was fired again for spending time during work hours making crude knives and daggers. In 1992, Paul and Sharon moved into a flat on Dandenong Road, Frankston. With Denyer being unemployed, Sharon held down 2 jobs by selling over the phone. With plenty of free time on his hands, it wasn't long before strange things began occurring around the block of flats on Dandenong Road. By 1993, Denyer was a social outcast, unable to hold down a job due to a mixture of laziness and incompetence, and it is believed during this time of unemployment, Denyer's macabre fantasies began to spill over into real life. For a 5-month period, he began to stalk the women in his neighbourhood. This stalking fantasy would eventually escalate, but the first instance began in February of 1993. Paul and Sharon had become quite friendly with their neighbours Tricia and her sister Donna, who lived with her fiancé Les and Donna's tiny baby in a block of flats nearby. One night, Les and Donna arrived home at about 11 p.m. with the baby after Les had finished work, only to find that their flat had been broken into. On the living room wall, next to the TV, was a message written in blood. Dead Don. Lying in the middle of the room was the remains of Donna's cat, Buffy. In the kitchen, another message had been left. Donna, you're dead. The house seemed to be sprayed with blood all over the walls, and the intruder had also torn out pages of pornographic magazines and left them strewn throughout the flat. It's fair to say that Donna never spent another night in the flat, and chillingly, Paul Denyer offered to help find whoever was responsible for the break-in and see personally to retribution. Just 4 months later, Paul Denyer would graduate from stalking and killing animals to attacking and murdering women to satisfy his bloodlust. So what would drive someone like Paul Denyer to act upon his dark fantasies? After his arrest, he was questioned by detectives about why there were only women victims, to which Denyer replied that he just hates women. At his trial, on December 15, 1993, the court heard from criminal psychologist Ian Joblin, who had been appointed to examine Denyer in prison while he was awaiting sentence. Dr. Joblin told the court that in his view, Denyer showed no remorse for his crimes. In fact, he revelled in the telling of the murders and seemed as if he got pleasure recounting them. Joblin also stated that Denyer was a sadist, whose pleasure and satisfaction dissipated after each murder so quickly that he would feel the need to kill again to satisfy those urges. Denyer told police that he dreamed of killing since the age of 14, and his defense team claimed during his plea hearing that he claimed to have been abused at a young age by a family member. Dr. Joblin refused this excuse, stating that millions of people all over the world had similar appalling situations, and that this does not give one an excuse to murder. Experts found Paul Denyer to be likely fitting into the category of sadistic personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Later on, a decade into his prison sentence, Paul Denyer began living as a woman, claiming he had only killed females because he was angry that he was not one. According to the first of the Paul Denyer letters, dated 29th of November 2003, Denyer claimed that these feelings of gender dysphoria are what led him to seek revenge against women by murdering them. Quote, "I committed these disgusting crimes, not because I have ever hated womankind, but because I have never really felt that I was male." End quote. Denyer began wearing women's clothing and cosmetics in prison, in defiance of prison orders. Medical specialists evaluated whether Denyer could receive sex reassignment surgery and rejected the idea. A lot of people have thought that this was just a stunt in order to receive a fairer hearing at his parole, due in 2023. It should be noted that Denyer has since reverted this gender identity as of 2022. In December of 1993, Paul Denyer was charged with 3 murder counts and 1 of abduction, charges to which he later pleaded guilty and did not contest. During examination, he also admitted by being influenced by the 1987 film The Stepfather, a horror film about an identity-assuming killer who murders his family. When recounting his gruesome acts upon innocent women, it was noted by police and psychologists that Denyer showed no emotion or remorse for his crimes. When detectives asked questions, they were answered in an almost condescending manner. Paul Denyer also described matter-of-factly how he killed his victims. At some parts, he seemed almost proud of his crimes. The psychologist, Dr. Ian Joblin, who examined Paul Denyer, told the court that out of all the adult offenders he had examined, and there had been many, that not one was even remotely close to the psychology of Paul Charles Denyer, that Paul was a rare breed, a killer who murdered at random and without motive. And this made him the most dangerous type of criminal. He also said that Denyer had a cruel and demeaning nature. He had exhibited aggression since childhood, and that there was no effective treatment for Denyer's sadistic personality. On December the 20th, 1993, Justice Frank Vincent sentenced Paul Denyer to 3 terms of life imprisonment with no fixed non-parole period. Justice Vincent said, quote, "The apprehension you have caused thousands of women in the community will be felt for a long time. For many, you are the fear that quickens their step as they walk home, or causes a parent to look anxiously at the clock when a child is late." End quote. Later, Paul Denyer appealed to the full court of the Supreme Court of Victoria against the severity of his sentence, and on July 29, 1994, he was granted a 30-year non-parole period, the equal highest non-parole period ever imposed in Victoria. The families of the victims felt cheated by the Supreme Court's decision. This non-parole period will end in July of 2023. If you feel that this sadistic killer should never be released, then I implore you to sign the petition linked below. Thanks for watching. This has been the final episode of the Frankston series here on Shadow Matter. If you made it to the end, congratulations. If you would like to be featured like these comments here, then leave a comment starting with Shadow Shoutout. And as always, if you like this video, then hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe to see more content like this, and don't forget to hit the notifications bell to keep up to date with the latest videos. And together, we can explore the strange, the terrifying, the unknown, the Shadow Matter.